June 19th, 1944, 1023 hours. Somewhere in the Philippine Sea, beneath a sky so blue it hurt to look at, Vice Admiral Marc Mitscher stood on the flag bridge of the USS Lexington, his weathered face turned westward. The air tasted of salt and aviation fuel. Around him, the greatest naval armada ever assembled in the Pacific rolled gently in swells that caught the morning light like hammered bronze. 42 carriers, 900 aircraft. And coming toward them, invisible beyond the horizon but closing fast, the desperate pride of Imperial Japan, every operational carrier plane the Empire could scrape together for one final, apocalyptic gamble. The radar operators had picked them up 20 minutes ago. Bogies inbound, many bogies. The Combat Information Center was alive with controlled urgency, voices crisp over the intercom, plotting boards being marked and remarked as the Japanese formations crystallized on the scopes. Mitscher's fighter director officers were practically vibrating with readiness. "Launch the Hellcats now," they urged. "Get our boys up there while we still have altitude advantage. Intercept them out at maximum range." Standard doctrine. Textbook defensive procedure. Mitscher said no. Wait. The deck officers exchanged glances. Wait for what? The enemy was coming. The radar signatures suggested over 300 aircraft, the largest Japanese carrier strike since Midway 2 years earlier. Every minute of delay meant the enemy got closer to the task force, closer to the vulnerable carriers, closer to the fat-bellied oilers and ammunition ships that kept this entire fleet alive. Launch doctrine called for immediate interception at maximum range. But Mitscher, with his leathery face and pilot's squint, watched the western horizon and said, "Wait, 1028 hours." Still he waited, 1033 hours. The air operations officers were sweating now despite the ocean breeze. On the flight decks below, pilots sat strapped in their cockpits, engines warm, watching the yellow-shirted deck handlers for the launch signal that didn't come. In the ready rooms, squadron commanders checked their watches, rechecked their navigation boards, tried to understand the delay. The Japanese were now estimated at 90 miles out, well within strike range. Still, Mitscher waited. What no one understood, yet what, perhaps only Mitscher himself intuited in that moment, was that he wasn't just fighting a battle. He was engineering an execution. Those 30 extra minutes weren't hesitation. They were calculation, cold, methodical, and utterly ruthless, because Marc Mitscher had read the intelligence reports. He knew what was coming toward him wasn't just 300 aircraft. It was the last gasp of Japanese naval aviation, flown by boys with 30 hours of flight time, guided by obsolete doctrine, sustained by nothing but courage and delusion. And he was going to let them come just close enough that when his fighters finally rose to meet them, there would be nowhere to run, nowhere to hide, and no possibility of escape. The decision wasn't made in that moment. It had been years in the making. To understand why Mitscher waited, you must first understand what Japanese naval aviators expected to find when they reached the American fleet that morning. You must understand what they had been told, what they believed, what sustained them through the terror of launching from carriers already low on fuel, already damaged, already operating at the ragged edge of mechanical collapse. They had been told they were the elite, the spiritual heirs of the warriors who had struck Pearl Harbor, who had sunk the Prince of Wales and the Repulse, who had chased the Allied fleets from the Java Sea to the Indian Ocean in those glorious first 6 months when it seemed the empire of the sun would never set. Their instructors at Tsuchiura and Yokosuka had taught them that Bushido, the warrior spirit, could overcome material disadvantage. That one Japanese pilot, properly trained and spiritually pure, was worth 5 Americans. That American pilots were soft, mechanically dependent, lacking the killer instinct that came from living close to death, from understanding that life was brief and honor eternal. They had been shown footage of burning American carriers at Coral Sea, of the Hornet sinking after Santa Cruz, of American pilots abandoning damaged aircraft rather than fighting to the death. "See," their instructors said, "they lack our resolve." What the instructors didn't show them was the industrial reality grinding away on the other side of the Pacific. They didn't show them the production lines at Grumman's Bethpage plant, where by 1944 they were rolling out F-6F Hellcats at a rate of 1 every 48 minutes, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. They didn't show them the training bases spreading across Texas and Florida and California, where American pilots were logging 400 hours of flight time before ever seeing combat, learning gunnery on towed targets, practicing carrier landings until it became muscle memory, studying tactical manuals that had been revised and perfected through 2 years of hard-won Pacific combat experience. They didn't show them the radar systems, the fighter direction doctrine, the elaborate combat air patrol systems that turned American carrier task forces into layered death zones where nothing approached unobserved and nothing hostile survived. The young pilots climbing into their Zeros and Judys and Jills that June morning believed they were flying toward victory. They had been told the Americans were reeling, that this strike would cripple the enemy fleet, that Japan's defensive perimeter would hold. They believed because they had to believe, because the alternative that they were flying towards systematic annihilation, that their empire had already lost, that their deaths would purchase nothing but a few hours' delay in the inevitable, was unthinkable. Lieutenant Sakio Komatsu, 22 years old, veteran of exactly 3 combat missions, checked his fuel gauge one last time before his Zero lifted from the deck of the carrier Zuikaku. The gauge showed full, but he knew the carrier had less than 40% fuel reserves remaining. There might not be enough for a second strike. This was it. The decisive battle. He thought of his mother in Osaka, of the cherry trees behind his childhood home, of the girlfriend who had promised to wait for his return. He did not think about the fact that his total flight time was 37 hours. He did not think about the fact that he had never successfully completed a torpedo run against a maneuvering target. He did not think about the fact that the American radar could see him coming from 150 miles away. He thought about honor, about duty, about the ancestors watching. He climbed into the morning sky, believing that spirit could overcome steel. He was wrong. And Marc Mitscher knew he was wrong. And that was why Mitscher waited. The waiting had doctrine behind it, though Mitscher's staff officers didn't fully understand it yet. The standard fighter interception doctrine called for launching the combat air patrol at maximum range, get the fighters up early, establish altitude advantage, hit the enemy while they're still climbing and assembling, but Mitscher had fought at Midway. He had seen what happened when American fighters were vectored out too far, when they burned their fuel chasing contacts that evaporated or shifted, when they scored kills, but came back with dry tanks and no reserves for a second wave. He had studied the after-action reports from the Marianas campaign, from the endless grinding attrition battles in the Solomons. He had learned that killing enemy aircraft wasn't enough. You had to kill them efficiently. You had to kill them in a way that spent their fuel, their morale, their organizational cohesion. You had to turn the battle into chaos, and then you had to methodically slaughter them in the chaos. So he waited. Let them come closer. Let them commit. Let them burn fuel just getting here. Let them fly at attack altitude where they had no energy advantage. Let them believe they were going to reach the carriers. And then, when they were too close to turn back, when their fuel state meant they were committed to either attacking or dying in the water, then he would launch. Then he would send up wave after wave of Hellcats, each one guided by radar vectors, each one positioned perfectly for high-side runs, each one flown by pilots with 400 hours of training and 2 years of combat doctrine refinement. He would turn the Philippine Sea into an abattoir, 1,036 hours. The Japanese strike was now 70 miles out, close enough that Mitscher could almost imagine hearing their engines. On the radar screens they looked like a swarm, a vast migrating cloud of contacts, hundreds of individual blips merging and separating in the formal patterns of military air formations. Raid 1, the CIC called it. Over 200 aircraft in 3 major groups. Behind them, already forming, Raid 2. Another 100 contacts. The Japanese were throwing everything they had into this strike. Everything. The last operational aircraft from 4 carriers, planes that couldn't be replaced, pilots who couldn't be replaced. This was the bet. All chips pushed to the center of the table. Everything on this one roll. Launch the first deck load, Mitscher said quietly. The flag bridge erupted into controlled frenzy. Launch orders transmitted. On the flight decks of 15 carriers, yellow-shirted handlers yanked wheel chocks and waved Hellcats forward. Engines that had been idling roared to full throttle. The first fighters rolled, accelerated, lifted. Within 90 seconds, the 1st Combat Air Patrol Division was airborne. Within 4 minutes, 45 Hellcats were climbing, guided by radar vectors toward intercept points that the combat information officers had been calculating for the past 20 minutes. Within 8 minutes, over 200 American fighters were in the air, more launching every 30 seconds from every available deck. The entire fleet converted into a vast aircraft launching machine that seemed to defy physics. How could this many planes come from this many ships this fast? The Japanese pilots saw them coming, saw the dark shapes rising from the eastern horizon, climbing fast, many more than expected. Lieutenant Komatsu felt his breath catch. The intelligence briefing had said the Americans might have 2 or 3 carriers in the area, but there were fighters everywhere, more launching even as he watched, the sky filling with them like angry wasps boiling from a kicked nest. His radio chattered with alarm, confusion, disbelief. Where were they all coming from? But Komatsu was a warrior. He had trained for this. He pushed his fear down, focused on his instruments, his gun sight, his formation. The American fighters were still distant, still climbing. If his group could maintain formation, could reach attack position, could coordinate with the torpedo bombers and dive bombers, they might still succeed. The Americans couldn't be everywhere at once. Spirit would prevail. It had to prevail. He was still thinking this when the 1st Hellcat Division hit his formation from above and behind, coming out of the sun in a textbook high-side gunnery run, and Lieutenant Sakio Komatsu's world became fire and noise, and the terrible understanding that everything he had been told was a lie. The Americans called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The name was coined within hours, spreading through the fleet with the grim humor of men who had just participated in something that looked less like combat and more like industrial slaughter. It wasn't a fair fight. It wasn't meant to be a fair fight. The entire architecture of American carrier doctrine by 1944 was designed to make fair fights impossible, to stack every advantage technological, numerical, tactical, operational, until the outcome was predetermined, until combat became not a contest, but a demonstration of overwhelming force meeting insufficient resistance. The statistics tell the story in cold numbers. Between 1,000 and 1,500 hours on June 19th, 1,944, Japanese naval aviation effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force. Of the approximately 373 aircraft launched in Raid 1 and Raid 2, 315 were shot down. Most of them never came within 10 miles of an American carrier. They were intercepted in layers, systematic killing zones established by fighter director officers watching radar screens, vectoring Hellcat divisions onto Japanese formations with the precision of traffic controllers, calling out altitudes and bearings and closure rates, while pilots climbed and dove and fired in the mechanical rhythm of practiced execution. The kill ratios were obscene. Some American pilots claimed 5 confirmed kills in a single mission. Many claimed 4. Even average pilots, men who considered themselves merely competent, came back with 2 or 3 certain victories. The Hellcats had every advantage: speed, armor, firepower, tactical coordination, radar vectoring, altitude, pilot experience, mechanical reliability. The Zeros and Judys and Jills had courage. It wasn't enough. It had never been enough. The mythology of Bushido shattered at 400 knots, bullets punching through unarmored fuel tanks, tearing through cockpits, shredding control surfaces, sending aircraft tumbling in flames toward a sea that would swallow them without trace. Commander David McCampbell, leading VF-15 from the Essex, shot down 9 aircraft in 2 missions that day. 9. He would later describe it in his after-action report with the clinical detachment of a man describing a particularly efficient day at the office. Targets were numerous and mostly inexperienced. executed overhead runs with altitude advantage, observed multiple confirmed kills with minimal ammunition expenditure, no damage sustained. Reading between the lines, you could almost see the disconnect, the profound gap between the mythic air combat of 1,942, diving, turning, desperate dogfights where victory went to the skilled and lucky, and this, which felt less like fighting and more like harvesting. The Japanese came in formations. The Americans broke the formations. The Japanese scattered. The Americans hunted them individually. The Japanese died. Lieutenant Komatsu never made it within 30 miles of an American carrier. His formation was intercepted at 1,041 hours by a division of Hellcats from VF-2. The Americans came from above, from the sun, exactly as textbooks said they would. Komatsu tried to turn into them, tried to bring his Zero's superior maneuverability into play, but maneuverability meant nothing when the American was already behind him, already firing, the 650 caliber machine guns converging at 300 yards exactly where Komatsu's aircraft would be in half a second. The bullets arrived before the sound. That was the last thing Komatsu learned, that at 400 knots, the bullets are faster than their own noise. His Zero's wing tore off. The aircraft rolled inverted, burning. He didn't get out. Very few of them got out. The altitude was too low, the speed too high, the damage too catastrophic. His girlfriend in Osaka would wait for years before accepting that he wasn't coming home. But Mitscher's decision, those 30 minutes of waiting, wasn't just about shooting down aircraft. That was the obvious result, the immediate tactical victory. The deeper purpose was fuel. Always fuel. Everything in the Pacific War came down to fuel eventually, to the simple mathematics of petroleum reserves and consumption rates, and the tyranny of distance. And Mitscher understood that by waiting, by forcing the Japanese to fly those extra minutes toward the American fleet, he was turning their own desperation into a death trap. The Japanese carriers had launched at extreme range. They had no choice. American submarines and air attacks had pushed them back, forced them to operate at the edge of their aircraft's combat radius. The strike aircraft that launched that morning did so knowing they were at the ragged edge of their fuel capacity. They had enough gas to reach the American fleet, conduct a brief attack, and return if everything went perfectly, if they didn't have to maneuver, if they didn't have to fight, if they weren't intercepted, if they maintained optimal altitude and airspeed for fuel economy. If. By forcing them to come closer, Mitscher burned their margin of error. Those extra 30 minutes weren't just 30 minutes. At cruise speed, at attack altitude, that was another 40 miles, another 15 gallons of fuel per aircraft, another 15 gallons that wouldn't be there for the return flight. And then the combat itself, the desperate evasive maneuvers, the full throttle runs trying to escape pursuing Hellcats, the scattered formations forced to find their way home individually rather than in fuel-efficient groups. By the time the surviving Japanese aircraft turned back toward their carriers, most of them were already on fumes, flying on gauges that showed below reserve, making calculations that didn't add up, knowing with sick certainty that they weren't going to make it. The ocean doesn't care about courage. Lieutenant Nakagawa, one of the few Zero pilots who survived the initial interception, shot down 3 Hellcats in a running battle that left his aircraft damaged and his fuel tank nearly empty. He broke off, turned west, began the long flight home. He flew perfectly, trimming for maximum fuel economy, maintaining optimal altitude, calculating and recalculating his fuel state against the distance remaining. He ran out at sunset, 40 miles short of his carrier. The engine coughed, seized, fell silent. In the sudden quiet, with the sun dying red on the western horizon and the ocean below turning to shadow, Nakagawa understood the full dimension of the trap. They hadn't lost because they were bad pilots. They had lost because the mathematics were designed to kill them. Even victory would have led to death even if they had sunk every American carrier. They still wouldn't have had the fuel to get home. He ditched the Zero as gently as possible, climbed out onto the wing as it sank, activated his emergency flotation device, and began floating in a sea that stretched empty to every horizon. He was picked up 4 days later by an American submarine. Delirious, sunburned, barely conscious. When the submarine crew gave him water and rice, he wept. Not from relief. From the realization of what that rice meant, what the clean water meant, what the casual abundance of American logistics meant. The submarine had more food on board than his entire carrier battle group. The submarine crew ate better than flag officers in the Imperial Navy. And there were hundreds of these submarines, thousands of these sailors, millions of tons of this food. He had thought Japan was fighting America. Sitting in that submarine's crew quarters, wrapped in a borrowed blanket, eating rice that tasted better than anything he'd had in a year, he understood that Japan wasn't fighting America. Japan was fighting arithmetic, and arithmetic always won. The symbolism of that rice would recur throughout the testimonies of captured Japanese servicemen in the final year of the war. Again and again, prisoners would describe the moment they fully understood they had lost, not lost a battle, but lost the war, lost any possible path to victory. And again, that moment came not from weapons but from food, from the realization that American forces ate like aristocrats, that even American rear echelon supply bases served fresh eggs and bacon, that American submarines carried ice cream makers. Ice cream makers on submarines, in a war zone. The profound obscenity of that abundance, not because it was wrong, but because it made victory impossible. Japanese naval doctrine had been built on the assumption of fighting a short, decisive war. Strike hard, win quickly, negotiate from strength. The entire carrier doctrine, the entire training pipeline, the entire strategic architecture assumed brief, violent encounters, followed by operational pauses for replenishment and repair. What they discovered instead was that America was willing to fight a long, grinding, attritional war, and moreover was capable of fighting such a war across 6,000 miles of ocean while simultaneously fighting another war across the Atlantic and Mediterranean, while simultaneously maintaining domestic abundance that meant rationing was an inconvenience rather than a catastrophe. The 30 minutes Mitscher waited was the distillation of that abundance. He could afford to wait. He had radar giving him perfect situational awareness. He had carriers that could launch aircraft faster than Japanese carriers could recover them. He had pilots fresh from training bases where they had logged more flight hours in their first year than Japanese pilots would accumulate in their entire careers. He had aircraft being built faster than they could be deployed. He had fuel. God, he had so much fuel. Oilers trailing the fleet, ready to replenish. Supply bases across the Pacific stocked with aviation gas. Refineries in Texas and California running 24 hours a day. The entire American economy, 14% of it converted to war production, geared to deliver petroleum and steel and aluminum and brass and rubber to the fleet, wherever the fleet was, however much the fleet needed. The Japanese had courage, discipline, warrior spirit, willingness to die. The Americans had petroleum and radar and industrial capacity and logistics. In 1944, in the Philippine Sea, those equations balanced decisively in favor of petroleum. The full scope of the disaster didn't become clear to Japanese commanders until nightfall. Aircraft straggled back through the dusk, damaged, fuel-starved, many ditching in sight of their carriers because they no longer had the gas for a landing approach. Air operations officers tallied the returns and felt their stomachs hollow out. Raid 1. 15 aircraft returned from 215 launched. Raid 2. 31 aircraft returned from 109 launched. The numbers were so catastrophic that at first they seemed like counting errors. Recheck the logs. Count again. But the numbers stayed the same. Japanese naval aviation had just lost over 300 aircraft and roughly 250 trained aircrew in 6 hours, aircraft that couldn't be replaced, pilots that couldn't be replaced. The last graduates of the old training schools, the last men who remembered how to land a kite on a pitching deck in a crosswind, all gone into the Pacific. Admiral Ozawa, commanding the Japanese carrier force, stared at the casualty reports and understood that the war was over. Not would be over. Was over. Japan still had carriers, still had some aircraft, still had the industrial capacity to build more. But it didn't matter. The gap had become unbridgeable. You couldn't train replacement pilots fast enough to make up these losses. You couldn't develop combat experience when your trained pilots were dead. You couldn't maintain carrier operations when you didn't have enough aircraft to form proper striking forces. The American fleet would keep growing, keep adding carriers, keep churning out aircraft and pilots and fuel and ammunition. The Japanese fleet would shrink, grow weaker, become increasingly desperate. Ozawa knew this with the cold certainty of a mathematician seeing an equation that only had one solution. He sailed back toward Okinawa with 4 carriers that between them carried 63 operational aircraft. 2 months earlier, those same 4 carriers had deployed with over 300. The Americans hadn't sunk a single carrier that day. They didn't need to. They had killed carrier aviation instead. The ships were just hulls now, metal boxes floating on water, strategically meaningless. Beautiful, expensive, carefully engineered graves. Meanwhile, on the Lexington, Marc Mitscher received the final tally reports and allowed himself the smallest smile. His air operations officer approached, tentative, and asked the question everyone was thinking. "Sir, if we'd launched earlier, if we'd intercepted at maximum range, would we have achieved the same results?" Mitscher looked at him, really looked at him, and the younger officer saw something in the Admiral's eyes that made him profoundly uncomfortable. Not satisfaction, not joy, something colder, something that understood that war wasn't about fair fights or honorable contests. War was about killing, and if you could arrange to kill the enemy efficiently, systematically, with minimal risk to your own forces, then that was good tactics. That was professional competence. That was what the country had paid for when it built these carriers and trained these pilots and spent these billions of dollars. "No," Mitscher said quietly. "If we'd launched earlier, we would have shot them down faster. But some of them would have had the fuel to escape. Some would have made it back to their carriers. And they would have tried again tomorrow, or next week, or next month. This way, the ones who survived the fighters died of fuel starvation. The aircraft that made it back are too damaged to repair. And the pilots who witnessed it, the ones who somehow survived and got back, they know now that they can't win. They've seen the gap. They understand the mathematics." He paused, watching the sun set over the Pacific, turning the water the color of blood. 30 minutes bought us 6 months of operational advantage, maybe more. It broke their spirit. The operations officer nodded slowly, understanding but not quite accepting. It felt too calculated, too ruthless. Wars were supposed to be about courage and determination and fighting spirit, but Mitscher understood that those were myths, comforting stories told to help young men climb into aircraft and fly toward probable death. The truth was uglier. The truth was resource management and logistics, and killing efficiency. The truth was, 30 minutes could mean the difference between victory and annihilation, not because of anything that happened in those 30 minutes, but because those 30 minutes changed everything that followed. In the weeks after the Great Marianas Turkey shoot, American intelligence officers began interrogating prisoners and analyzing captured documents. What they found was more devastating than any battle damage assessment. They found evidence of Japan's training programs collapsing, of flight schools graduating pilots with 20 hours of stick time, of fuel shortages so severe that advanced trainees were practicing carrier landings on land bases because they couldn't afford to operate real carriers for training. They found reports of carrier crews who had never conducted a full-speed launch and recovery cycle, of maintenance personnel who had never serviced a fully armed strike, of entire air groups that had never trained together as units before being thrown into combat. The reports painted a picture of an empire eating its seed corn. Every loss in the Marianas couldn't be replaced with equivalent quality. The replacements were younger, greener, more poorly trained, and those replacements were being fed into a meat grinder where they faced American pilots who just kept getting better, kept refining tactics, kept building on institutional experience. The gap wasn't closing. It was widening, exponentially. Commander Fuchida Mitsuo, who had led the Pearl Harbor attack, who had survived the war's early battles, who had witnessed Japan's descent from triumphant empire to desperate holdout, would later write in his memoirs about the moment he understood defeat was certain. It wasn't Midway. It wasn't Guadalcanal. It was reading the casualty reports from June 19th and realizing that Japan had lost its carrier arm entirely in a single day. "We had prepared for a decisive battle," he wrote. "We believed that if we could just engage the Americans in the right circumstances, with the right coordination, our spirit would prevail. But they didn't give us circumstances. They gave us a mechanism. They turned combat into a machine that processed inputs our aircraft and produced outputs our deaths, efficiently, relentlessly. We had no counter for that. Courage cannot defeat machinery." The American analysis was more clinical but reached the same conclusion. The U.S. Naval War College would later study the Battle of the Philippine Sea as a textbook example of force multiplication through superior systems integration. Radar plus fighter direction plus radio coordination plus tactical doctrine plus aircraft performance plus pilot training plus logistics equaled combat effectiveness that was greater than the sum of parts. The Japanese had some of these elements. The Americans had all of them, and had refined them through 2 years of combat iteration. The result was a force that didn't just win engagements. It made engagements unwinnable for the opponent. The symbolic power of Mitscher's weight extended beyond that single battle. In the year that followed, as American forces island-hopped toward Japan, as the noose tightened and the Empire's defensive perimeter collapsed inward, Japanese commanders found themselves unable to effectively respond with carrier aviation. Not because they lacked carriers, though several had been sunk, but because they lacked the trained pilots and cohesive air groups to operate carriers offensively. The Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944 saw Japanese carriers deployed as decoys, bait to lure American forces away from the actual attack. Carriers used as bait. The concept would have been unthinkable in 1942. In 1944, it was operational necessity. The carriers couldn't strike effectively, but they could still draw attention. So they sailed north with skeleton air groups, hoping to be noticed, hoping to die usefully by distracting the enemy from the real attack. It didn't work. American forces, guided by the same comprehensive intelligence and operational awareness that Mitscher had used in the Philippine Sea, saw through the deception, split their forces, and destroyed both the decoy carriers and the surface battle groups that were supposed to be protected by the diversion. Japanese naval aviation effectively ceased to exist after Leyte Gulf. What followed the kamikaze campaigns, the desperate suicide strikes, were the tactics of an air force that had given up on conventional victory and was simply trying to make defeat expensive for the enemy. American pilots flying off carriers in 1945 sometimes went entire missions without seeing Japanese aircraft. The sky belonged to the Americans. They could loiter over Japanese air bases, shooting up aircraft on the ground, bombing hangars, strafing runways, with the casual impunity of wolves wandering through a depleted sheep pen. The few Japanese aircraft that did manage to get airborne were flying on fuel reserves so limited that they could only make one-way trips, could only strike if they were willing to crash afterward. These were no longer combat operations. They were elaborately staged suicides, and all of it traced back, in threads both obvious and subtle, to June 19th, 1944. To the moment when Marc Mitscher looked at radar screens showing incoming Japanese strikes and made the calculated decision to wait, to let them come closer, to burn their fuel, to set the trap perfectly. Those 30 minutes didn't win the Pacific War, but they removed any remaining possibility that Japan could contest air superiority. They established American dominance so thoroughly that every subsequent operation proceeded with the assumption of air supremacy. That assumption shaped island assault plans, shaped naval bombardment tactics, shaped the entire operational rhythm of the final year of the war. There's a photograph taken on the Lexington on the evening of June 19th. It shows Mitscher on the flag bridge, his face shadowed under his distinctive long-brimmed cap, eyes distant. Behind him, deck crews are rearming aircraft for potential night operations. The photo is sharp, well composed, almost theatrical in its lighting. It became one of the iconic images of the Pacific War, reproduced in newspapers and magazines, used in recruiting posters, eventually displayed in the Naval War College as a representation of professional command excellence. But if you look closely at Mitscher's expression in that photograph, you see something the propaganda posters didn't emphasize. You see exhaustion. Not physical, the man was tough as boot leather, but moral. The weariness of someone who has just orchestrated the methodical killing of hundreds of young men and knows it was necessary, and knows it was right, and knows it doesn't make it any easier to live with. Mitscher was a pilot himself. He understood what it felt like to be in that cockpit, fuel gauge dropping, engines sputtering, ocean rising up. He had sent men to those deaths deliberately, with calculation, with 30 minutes of waiting that maximized their terror and minimized their chances. It was good tactics. It was professional excellence. It was the right decision. It still cost something to make it. In his personal papers, archived after his death, there's a letter Mitscher wrote to his wife 3 days after the battle. He doesn't describe the tactical details, those were classified. He doesn't mention casualty figures or victory claims. Instead, he writes about hearing the radio chatter from his pilots, listening to them call out kills with the casual enthusiasm of hunters describing good shooting. He writes about feeling proud of them and disturbed by them simultaneously. "They're good boys," he writes. "They're doing exactly what we trained them to do. They're winning. But I wonder sometimes if we've made them too efficient at killing. If when this war ends, they'll be able to turn it off." The letter provides a glimpse behind the professional facade, shows the human cost of command. Mitscher wasn't a monster. He was a professional doing a monstrous job because the alternative, losing, letting Americans die instead, was worse. The 30 minutes weren't sadism. They were efficiency. But efficiency in killing still means killing, and Mitscher understood the moral weight of that even as he recognized its necessity. The Japanese pilots who died that day, Lieutenant Komatsu, Lieutenant Nakagawa, floating in the ocean watching his fuel gauge hit zero, the hundreds of others whose names we don't know, they died because their country had started a war. It couldn't finish against an opponent it hadn't understood. They died brave. They died disciplined. They died believing, many of them, that their deaths served a greater purpose. But they died primarily because Marc Mitscher waited 30 minutes, and those 30 minutes transformed a battle into a slaughter, and the slaughter into a strategic turning point that ended Japanese naval aviation as an effective force. The epilogue to the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot isn't found in casualty statistics or tactical analyses. It's found in the post-war testimonies of survivors, on both sides, trying to make sense of what they had experienced. American pilots described a kind of cognitive dissonance, proud of their skill, glad to have survived, but disturbed by how easy it had been. "It didn't feel like combat," one VF-15 pilot recalled. "It felt like a drill, like training. They came in. We shot them down. They came in. We shot them down. It was mechanical. I kept waiting for it to get hard, for them to adapt, for something to change. But they just kept coming, and we just kept killing them, and it never changed." Japanese survivors described betrayal. Not by their commanders, they understood the commanders were doing their best with insufficient resources, but betrayal by the mythology they had been fed, the lies about American weakness and Japanese spiritual superiority, and the inevitable victory of Bushido over materialism. "We were told Americans couldn't fight at night," one captured pilot said during interrogation. "We were told they relied on machines because they lacked warrior spirit. We were told many things. All lies. They fought better than us because they had better training, better equipment, better organization, better everything. Spirit doesn't matter when the other man has radar and you don't. Courage doesn't matter when his aircraft can outrun yours, and his bullets can penetrate your armor, and his logistics can sustain operations while yours are falling apart." The American interrogator noted that the prisoner wasn't bitter when he said this, just tired. A man who had believed in something profound and discovered it was mythology, and was now left with nothing but the wreckage of that belief. The interrogator, a reserve officer who in civilian life had been a professor of psychology, wrote in his report that he believed many Japanese prisoners were experiencing a kind of philosophical collapse, the destruction not just of their military, but of their worldview. They had been raised to believe certain truths, that discipline and spirit could overcome material disadvantage, that death in service was the highest honor, that Japan was destined for greatness. The war hadn't just defeated them, it had disproven their philosophy, and they were struggling to reconstruct meaning in the absence of those discredited beliefs. The American experience was different, but perhaps equally complex. American servicemen came home to a country that had won, that celebrated their victory, that built monuments and held parades and told stories of the greatest generation. But many of the men who had actually fought, who had participated in battles like the Turkey Shoot, found the celebration dissonant. They had witnessed industrial killing. They had been part of a machine that processed human beings into corpses with remarkable efficiency. It was necessary. It was justified. It was still haunting in ways that were difficult to articulate to people who hadn't been there, who wanted simple narratives of good versus evil, heroism versus villainy. Mitscher himself rarely spoke about the battle after the war. In his memoirs, published posthumously, he devoted less than a page to June 19, 1944. The account is factual, clinical, devoid of the moral complexity evident in his private letters. Contact established at 1020. Delayed launch to optimize intercept geometry. Achieved superior kill ratio due to tactical positioning and pilot skill. Enemy force destroyed as effective combat unit. 60 words to describe the day he ended Japanese naval aviation. But between the lines, in what's not said, you can sense his ambivalence. The professional pride in having executed perfectly. The human cost of that perfection. There is a Zen koan about a warrior who becomes so skilled with the sword that he no longer needs to draw it. His mastery is so complete that opponents recognize their defeat before combat begins. The ideal victory, the koan suggests, is the one that requires no violence because the outcome is so obvious that fighting becomes pointless. Marc Mitscher's 30-minute wait was the industrial age equivalent of that koan. He created conditions where the Japanese defeat was so thorough, so mathematically certain, that continued resistance was pointless. The violence still happened, hundreds of aircraft shot down, hundreds of men killed, but the outcome was predetermined by those 30 minutes of calculation. This is the future of warfare that Mitscher helped create. Combat as systems optimization, battles as engineering problems, victory determined by logistics and training and industrial capacity long before the first shot is fired. The individual heroism still matters. The pilots still had to fly well, shoot straight, maintain discipline under pressure. But individual heroism operates within systems that are larger, more complex, more determinative of outcome. The best pilot in the world, flying an inferior aircraft, guided by inadequate doctrine, supported by collapsing logistics, will lose to an average pilot with superior systems backing him. This is what Lieutenant Komatsu discovered in the moments before his Zero's wing tore off. This is what Lieutenant Nakagawa understood, floating in the Pacific, watching the sun set on his fuel-exhausted aircraft and his fuel-exhausted empire. This is what the kamikaze pilots would learn in the desperate final year of the war, when courage divorced from effective systems became just elaborate suicide. And this is what American servicemen returned home understanding, even if they couldn't quite articulate it. A military force that combined technological superiority with institutional excellence in a way that made traditional notions of warrior valor almost quaint. The 30 minutes Mitscher waited crystallized this transformation. They represented the moment when industrial warfare reached its mature form, when combat became process, and victory became output, and death became a statistic in a logbook. It was efficient. It was necessary. It won the war. But it also changed what war meant, changed what victory cost, changed the relationship between the individual warrior and the vast machinery of modern conflict. Today, the waters off the Mariana Islands are quiet. The wrecks of aircraft lie scattered across the ocean floor, aluminum ghosts in the deep. Occasionally, diving expeditions find them a Zero's tail section, a Hellcat's engine block, pieces of fuselage with serial numbers still visible. The fish swim through open cockpits where men once sat, breathing hard, watching fuel gauges, praying in Japanese or English for just a few more miles. The ocean has reclaimed these artifacts, covered them in coral, turned them into artificial reefs that support ecosystems oblivious to the violence that brought them there. But the battle's legacy persists in forms less tangible than wreckage. In the doctrine taught at the Naval War College, where Mitscher's decision is studied as an example of optimizing combat geometry. In the fighter direction systems developed for modern carriers, direct descendants of the radar-guided intercepts that made the turkey shoot possible. In the institutional culture of the U.S. Navy, which emphasizes training intensity and systems integration and the patient development of operational excellence. In the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force, which rebuilt after the war with a profound understanding of logistics and combined arms coordination, learned through the catastrophic failure of those same elements in 1944. Most intangibly, the legacy persists in the questions Mitscher's decision raises about the nature of command. What does it mean to be good at war? Is it the same as being good? Can efficiency in killing be a virtue? When does professional competence shade into something darker? These questions don't have clean answers. Mitscher made the right call by any tactical or strategic measure. He saved American lives. He shortened the war. He executed his mission with skill that bordered on artistry, and he did it by creating conditions that maximized enemy deaths and minimized their options and destroyed their hope of survival. The soldiers who died in the Philippine Sea on June 19, 1944, Japanese and American, both believed they were fighting for something larger than themselves. For their countries, their families, their values, their visions of how the world should be ordered. They weren't wrong. Wars are fought for reasons, and the reasons in the Pacific were real and significant. But they died primarily because of decisions made by men like Mitscher, men who understood that war is mathematics draped in flags, that victory goes to the side that can outproduce, out-train, out-organize the opponent, that heroism matters but logistics matters more. The 30 minutes Marc Mitscher waited on the morning of June 19, 1944, were minutes in which he chose to let young men fly closer to their deaths, to burn fuel they would need for survival, to commit them irrevocably to attacks that would fail and leave them defenseless. It was cruel. It was calculated. It was brilliant tactics. It was the kind of decision that wins wars and costs souls, that history records as triumph and conscience experiences as burden. And when the sun set that evening over the Philippine Sea, painting the water blood red in the tropical dusk, Marc Mitscher stood on the flag bridge and watched his aircraft recover and knew that he had broken Japanese naval aviation forever. Knew that those 30 minutes had purchased months of operational freedom, knew that his decision would be studied and praised and taught to future generations of officers as an example of command excellence. He also knew, though he told no one but his wife in a letter he would write past midnight in his cabin, that he would hear those Japanese pilots on the radio for the rest of his life, hear them calling to each other in the confused moments when the Hellcats dove from above, hear the engines coughing as fuel ran out, hear the silence that followed. 30 minutes. The difference between combat and slaughter, the duration of a decision that ended an empire's dreams, the space between necessary and unforgivable, where all honest military history lives. The ocean remembers. The aircraft are still down there, waiting in the dark.